You join me today on the Staffs Worcester Canal. I'm fishing on the Birmingham Anglers Association water at Swindon Lock, which is just south of Wolverhampton. During the video I'm going to take you through tips relating to fishing a canal such as this during the winter and autumn months. Let's get started. The first tip we're going to look at is swim selection. Obviously swim selection is such a critical part to the day. And I don't mind admitting on this occasion I spoke to one of my good friends, Paul Bick, who's also in the super team. He's local to this venue and fishes it a lot. And he suggested I try this section down where we've got this bank of trees on the far bank. You'll notice on lots of canals such as this you've got barren areas and then you've got areas with trees. And trees offer such a fantastic holding area for fish. So that's the first main reason why I came here. The second main reason is that it's a little bit wider and it gives me two options. I'm going to be fishing tight over to that cover and I'm also going to fish down the middle of the canal. A good point to think about when you think about fishing on canals is the fact that there's nearly always a boat channel. So the water in the middle, the depth in the middle of the canal is deeper and it slowly, gradually shallows up to the far bank. So you'll find that the wary fish like chub and carp will hug the far bank features. They want that security from the cover. Also, it's a natural holding place for them. A lot of natural food will fall into the canal. So that's where they want to live. But the remainder of the canal will also hold fish. So the deeper middle part of the canal can come into its own in the colder months when that deeper water will be just that little bit warmer and fish like roach and perch will hold in the deeper water. So that's a little bit about swim selection. I've got to emphasise how important it is and how important local knowledge is. If you were just to come to a venue cold, it's going to be difficult. You'll probably catch fish, but to catch a good net of fish, local knowledge from friends and local tackle shops is absolutely invaluable. Okay, let's look at the rigs that I'm using today. I've actually got two different types of rigs to cater for the two different places in the swim that I'm going to fish. For fishing tight over to the far bank features, I'm going to use a dibber style float. Now, a dibber style float like this is really a big help when you're fishing in shallow water. As I mentioned, the depth over by the trees is relatively shallow. I'm fishing between about 2 foot and 1 foot deep. So the short, stubby dibber style float means that I'm not causing much disturbance in the water by having a big float. And also the fact that you've got this thicker tip makes it much more visible to see against the far bank trees and bushes and the dappled light effect that you can get. So that's a good reason for using a dibber float like that. The rig itself is very simple. I've just got 3 number 10 shot that I've spaced out below the float. I've got a relatively long section of line with no shot on because I'm going to be fishing over depth. I'm probably going to be fishing around about 6 inches over depth and I'm going to dictate that distance depending on the flow of the water. The canal will vary its flow. So in order to present the bait correctly on the bottom, I need to fish over depth. That's particularly true when I'm using bigger baits such as worms. So that's a very simple rig. I'm actually using a quite heavy line. I'm using diameter 018 Berkeley XWR, which is a very tough and reliable line. The target species that I'm looking for on this rig is chub. and chub fight hard and they actually grow quite big in the canal. So I've got to be able to hook the fish and pull them away from the far bank to prevent them from snagging up. So the gear needs to be quite stout. That's why I'm using 018, which has a breaking strain of around about 4-pound line. And I've got two different hooks, both strong hooks. I've got a size 10 hook for use with a lobworm or lobworm tail, and I've got a size 16 or 18 hook for use with caster. A really key thing to mention is the elastic. I'm using quite heavy elastic, obviously, to match up with the heavy gear that I'm using. This is a number 12 solid elastic, and you'll note that I've only threaded it through the tip section of this power top. If I were to use a normal length of elastic that you'd use in a power top, so through the top two, you find that too much elastic comes out and the chub can nail you on the far bank before you've had time to ship the pole back. So reducing the length of the elastic helps you to command the fish and pull it away from the far bank. Also, I prefer using a solid elastic in these situations because, again, a hollow elastic will just stretch too much and you've got a big chance of losing the fish. So that's the basic rig and setup from a far bank chub rig. The rig for fishing down the middle of the canal is very different. As I mentioned, the depth is far greater down the middle boat channel. The depth on this peg's around about 5 foot deep. And I'm using a much finer and more sensitive rig. I'm targeting roach and perch, and because I'm fishing down the middle of the canal, I've got a bit more chance, if I hook a better fish, to keep it away from the far bank snags. So I'm not fishing so heavy. The aim of this rig is to try and catch whatever I can out of the swim. Obviously this time of year when the weather's gone colder, the fishing can be hard. So you want to try and start off by catching something, and this is the rig to do that. Basically on this line, I'm just going to loose feed maggots, and I'm going to loose feed them sparingly, just 2 or 3 maggots at a time. The diameter of the main line on this rig is 0.010 XWR, and I've got a fine diameter 0.8 hook length. I've coupled that to a size 20 fine wire hook, and I've got a small bulk of number 10 shot around about 2 foot from the hook, and I've got 2 dropper shot. So coupled with this nice fine slim 0.2 gram float, I'm going to be able to present the bait very naturally and hopefully catch some nice roach and silverfish down the middle of the canal. So as always, a key factor when you're fishing is feeding. And we talked about employing 2 different tactics. One with maggots down the middle of the canal, and I'm just going to drip feed standard bronze maggots with a few reds in. I've cooked in a good handful at the start down the middle of the canal, and then I've just been loose feeding 5 or 6 maggots over the top quite regularly every 2 or 3 minutes. So that's a really good way to just start your peg off and just see what's feeding in your swim. Then for fishing over, I'm going to feed 2 different swims to give me 2 different options. One of them's just bog standard hempen casters. Obviously hempen casters, such a proven bait for chub and roach, and I'm just going to loose feed hempen casters in one spot of the swim, tight over to the trees. Then I've selected another swim in a different part, further away but still opposite the trees, and I'm going to feed chopped lobworm and casters. Now lobworms have got to be the best fish catching bait available, I think. I do prefer lobworms over dendrobina worms, and I'll chop 3 or 4 big lobworms up finely and mix them with some casters. Okay, so let's look at the hook baits. The first hook bait I'm going to show you is on my worm rig, and I've actually cut off the tail of a lobworm, and I'm going to thread that tail onto the size 10 wide gape hook. I like to do that because it means that I can hide the hook in the section of worm, but the size 10, as you can see there, still protrudes from the section of the worm, which means that the hook point is available to penetrate into the fish's mouth easily. Okay, the next bait to look at is the caster. I've got a size 18 hook, and for most of my canal fishing I like to bury the caster inside, bury the hook inside the caster. And to do that I just gently get the hook point into the pointed end of the caster and very gently thread it on, and then push the shank of the hook and the spade into the caster. So you can see there that the hook is completely hidden inside the caster. That's got to be one of the most sneaky ways of presenting the caster. If you were missing bites from smaller fish such as roach, it can be a good idea to hook the caster in a similar way to hooking a maggot. So I just hook it through the head, and I've got some of the hook protruding so that I can hook the fast biting fish easier. And another good tip when you're fishing for bigger fish such as chub is to try double caster. Now I can still fish a double caster on this size 18. So there you go, there's 2 casters. That's a very successful chub bait. And then finally, on my finer maggot rig, it's just a case of hooking the maggot in the correct way. I've got a size 22 B560 hook, and I'm just going to gently nick the hook into the flap of skin at the fat end of the maggot, so that I don't burst the maggot and I allow the maggot to behave naturally and achieve a very good presentation. So the swim I selected to fish down the track or in the deepest part of the canal is I've actually, instead of going straight out in front of me, I've actually got 8 meters of pole and I'm fishing down the peg. And I've done that for 2 reasons. One reason is that the canal is actually flowing from right to left, and I want to be able to lay my rig in and present it in the most efficient way possible. So it's much easier to lay the rig in and hold it back against the general flow of the canal. And also the wind, sometimes the wind's blowing this way down the canal. So it's much more beneficial to fish that way. I'll also feed another line at 8 meters in the other direction as well. Sometimes it's good to feed 2 lines because you can switch between the 2 lines, picking fish off both lines. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, I kick-started this swim by cupping in a small handful of maggots, and I've just been loose feeding gradually over the top to build the swim up. That way you can ensure that you don't overfeed the fish and just get a feel for how the fish are responding. There we go, there's a small fish. I think it's just a gudgeon. Oh, it's a small roach. Obviously that boat's just come through my swim and stopped me from fishing, but I actually think boats can actually have an advantageous effect on the fishing, particularly this time of year when there's not too many boats, and the movement of the water to allow the boat through the locks sometimes can actually kick-start the fish into feeding. So don't always look negatively about boats when you're fishing on canals. The great thing about building your swim up like this by starting down the middle is that you'll often find you'll catch some small fish quite quickly, and it just enables you to prime the far bank swim as well, so you can give the fish on the far bank some confidence in feeding instead of going straight over. You'll also be surprised that you can catch some big roach and big fish, even chub, down the middle of the canal, particularly in colder times when there's not so many boats about. So, as I said, I'm loose feeding very regularly, and I'm also lifting and dropping the float back in as well to try to mimic the fall of the maggots through down to the bottom. I'll probably only leave the rig in for 10-15 seconds every time and then lift it out and drop it back in again. There we go. That's the stamper roach we're talking about. Nice fish, great weight builders, and a great way to kickstart your peg. Let's have a look over on the far bank line. So let's have a look and see if we can get a chub on the worm line. It is tricky when you're fishing tight over to the far bank, so you can imagine it's easy to get your rig caught up in the trees. That's why it's important to fish a short length of line between the pole tip and the float, so you can poke the float right close into the far bank. It's also difficult when you strike. Just be mindful to try and strike away from the bushes to prevent the line catching the bushes, but also help you pull the chub away from the far bank. So if I get a bite now, I'm going to strike to the right and pull my pole round to the right to get the fish away from that tree. And same with the trap rig. I'll keep lifting the bait out and lowering it back in, just to help create a natural fall of bait, which fish like chub are so used to intercepting with natural food falling off the trees. So I want to keep lifting and lowering the bait in. So on the far bank line, you can see that I'm fishing right under the far bank bushes. There's a chub. I'm having to push the pole back really fast to keep the chub away from the far bank snags. But once I've got him away from the snags and down the middle, I can take my time. But that's why it's so important to use that solid elastic to pull the fish quickly away from the snags. Nice one. That's the chub around about £1.5 pounds. I've had them up to £4 today, so it just shows the potential of the chub on this stretch of canal.